takes to go up the academic ladder. So I look at the equality that we have, and this is nuanced by women's private and reproductive roles. So if you take maternity leave, then this affects your public and productive roles. So if you're required to produce articles, how do you do it? Unless, of course, we make sure that when the baby is asleep, we hire a research assistant to come and work with you so that you continue to be prolific. So the public productive is affected by the private reproductive. So equality then becomes almost a platitude. And you only enjoy equality, in my view, when you become androgynous, when your private reproductive roles don't really have any impact on your public productive. And that is a long time coming, when you are a grandmother perchance, and if you are not a grandmother looking after your children's children. Then ownership and inheritance of land, again on gender, the land has its owners, and I have discovered those owners are not women. And I explained that in the article. And in research we did again with under Women and Law in East Africa, the question people kept asking in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania is, how can property own property? If dowry is paid for you, you are property. So how can property really own property? The other fallacy of equality is in the area of property. Again, the equality of tenures, where they say that public, private, community tenure regimes are equal. This is after years of what Okoth Ogendo calls exploitation, suppression, and subversion of community rights to land. So how will community rights to land, which have only stuck because of resilience, be equal to the public and the private, especially when, as we speak now, we already have laws implementing the Constitution on public and private rights, but there is none on community land. So my argument is, if the tenure types are not equal, the holders of the rights under them cannot be equal, and they cannot enjoy the same amount of constitutional protection of the right to property. And it actually then goes again to multiple exclusions, because the marginalized tenure is actually for marginalized groups of pastoralists and forest dwellers. Then my very final fallacy is the knowledge hegemonies on knowledge control and how the information generation and dissemination is controlled. Again, knowledge is a powerful instrument, and especially in this digital age. But if you have people about whom there is no information, so in the world they really don't exist. And in fact, when they talk about ranking of universities, I suspect that this is the problem. The fact that maybe if we have our research, it's on our shelves. And so nobody really knows about what we do. There is poor visibility of African scholarship. There are many problems, and I don't want to talk about those today, but you know why scholars in our part of the world don't publish. Talking about legal publications, there are scarcity of forums for publishing this research. So we leave the production to outsiders. And you see, to be able to put your journal in those outside fora, you need to fit with the readership. We have had experiences where you write a good article and it is actually lying on the shelf as they look for like articles to produce a special issue. It's not because it's not rigorous research, but because their primary clientele is not people interested in the Ogiek and the Sengwer. So how do we counter the fallacies? I go back again, if they are not equal, they will not be equal, and normative equality is not going to yield equality of outcomes because they are overlaying, intersecting, and multiple inequalities. But I don't want to stop at a doom and gloom place. It's not all doom and gloom, because looking at human rights, they are malleable. Every time we have, they are actually a double-edged sword. There is inherent instability in human rights, and this is a pathway for dealing with the chiasmus or tension, which I identified at the beginning. This provides the space for bringing others from the excluded to the included space. Human rights aren't settled. They are always up for grabs. We always have new people claiming rights, and they admit those claimants. So how do we counter the fallacies? I think we need to locate and understand legal subjects beyond the boxes. So we should actually focus on inequality intersection. We also really need to strategize on how to deal with gatekeepers, because people who hold rights never cede them willingly. We need to use measures beyond law to challenge, engage, and disarm these gatekeepers. We also need to look beyond formal equality, pursue equity. And here, I think what we need to do in our country is to unpack. Again, I'm happy that the Chief Justice is here, because I think the judiciary has a very big role to play. They are the vanguards of equality and non-discrimination, because the new legal order is a radical one, and it's going to be opposed by others. They should demand fidelity to the Constitution by not just executive, legislature, and the public, but also the judiciary itself. And they should also mediate between the old and new order to ensure that the old order does not come back through the back door. Give life to equality and non-discrimination provisions, and ensure that constitutional entitlements for subjects are not lost because of legislative or even executive laxity. And actually, there are lessons to be learned from South Africa, where there was a radical change and the judiciary played a very important role. Then countering knowledge hegemonies by investing in research on multiple exclusion, publishing and disseminating those findings. Having subjects of law who are excluded or who suffer inequality exchange ideas so that they begin to empathize with each other and also to see the differences and also the similarities. Establishment of a culture of rigorous research in universities, and also promoting scholarship in the promotion criteria by giving a lot of weight to contributions to African discourses, and also using African discourses in local text, in curricula. So I'm now going to the very end, the epilogue. Individuals and states, myself and yourself, must take responsibility for their being treated equally, not being subjected to discrimination, and being included. Law can facilitate that, but it has its limits. So we need to engage measures outside of law and only use law to enable and buttress the rights. If you find that the seats around the table are taken, Professor Maria Nzomo, carry a stool if you must, because most people will not have the guts to tell you to leave when you are already there. And finally, I'll take you to a part of my inaugural that you may miss out on. The woman to whom I dedicate this lecture, my paternal grandmother, an educated, petite, soft-spoken woman, but surmounted gender exclusions through very subtle, seemingly minuscule, but powerful actions she took every day, every hour. She taught me in a real way that we all have a personal responsibility to ensure that we are included. I thank you.
I'm not as good as Kamenyi, but can we give a better clap than that one? Thank you very much, Professor Patricia Kameli-Mbote, for it's going to be a real question, which I live with every day, because we are told you must obey the law, isn't it? And whatever the law says must be correct. And the new constitution also says that every person has certain rights, isn't it? And some of those rights include the fact that you can go and demonstrate, for example, and you can go on strike, for example. It's everybody's right. But the law also says that as you do all that, you have to respect the rights of others. And here comes the problem. If you are going to make sure that your rights are respected, then you have to be violent. And when you are violent, you are breaking the law. So I would like Professor Mbote to address this very clearly, because every day I run the university, this is a nightmare for me. My staff say they are free to go on strike, and they go into rooms and remove everybody else who is not striking. They beat some of them, and then I say, now, if I use force, I'll be breaking the law, isn't it? And the human rights people who are full in this room will say, you see, that one is not suitable. So this fallacy, I'm a little bit confused. That is my first, I've just behaved like an African. Now let's see, let's start this way.
First of all, Patricia, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting and lively presentation. I think we all appreciate it very much. And I must say that when I first heard Patricia in 2006, when I returned to Nairobi after 10 years, over 10 years in Geneva as head of Environmental Law Department of UNEP, I just heard Patricia presenting very interesting lecture about gender and environmental law and environment protection in UNEP, and then I was trying to convince her to come and join UNEP. And she was very reluctant about it, and it's good for her. Now I understand why she didn't want to go to UNEP, because she really managed much better, and she chose to be scholar. I have 3 questions.
No.
Yes. One. Okay, one. Okay, so let me have 1.5. One is that Patricia said, should the trees have standing? And it was such a fun for students at that time. In a way, through the development of environmental law and locus standi, recently we can say that to a certain extent the trees have standing, because everybody can now file the case into court for the protection of trees. So this is the change which is unbelievable in these few years. And then state of law, how the states are in front of international law.
I was just going to ask about equality and inequality, and I just wanted to take the example of being equal before the law. And therefore, one person is rich, he goes for a top-notch lawyer. One person is poor, you go for a run-in-the-mill lawyer. And therefore, you find that you are right in law, but you had a poor lawyer, and the judgment was against you. Is that equality and inequality contradiction?
Thank you very much, Professor Mbote and Hamala and Lawyer Kama. I like very much, and I think I agree with what you have said. My only worry is that you have not referenced Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is probably the greatest welfare economist in the world at the moment. And he has made this illustration using economics and saying that formal rights should be improved by looking at capabilities and therefore supplementing the disabilities that people have. Just in a nutshell, how do you distinguish the feminist approach from Sen and maybe John Rawls' approaches to improving formal rights?
I think all the examples that you're giving show exactly what we are talking about. That, like when you talk about one's right is protected, and you're supposed to ensure that when your right is protected, you don't actually trample on the rights of others. And you see, it is that, I use the term chaesmas, I try to look, what is the simple way of putting this word? Because I try not to use very legalistic words. And I couldn't think about, it's contradictions, inherent contradictions, that you're saying it, but you're already contradicting it on the other hand. And I think, Vice Chancellor, it looks like you need legal advice on dealing with industrial action. And I've given the answer about the protection of all other rights, but I could still give a detailed rendition of legal advice. And then, should trees have standing? Should trees have standing was written in 1972 by Christopher Stone. And I was actually very privileged last year to edit a journal which revisited Stone after 40 years. And Christopher Stone himself wrote an article reflecting on what had he thought about then and what is happening now. And actually what you're saying is true. In essence, we don't say that environmental resources have rights, but we treat them with a lot more respect than we did before. So we haven't gone to the extent of what was provided for in the World Charter for Nature, but we are now moving a little bit away from anthropocentrism, where we protect environmental resources for ourselves as humans, to looking at the resources. And this is because of the problems that have come up: climate change, loss of biodiversity, loss of species, etc. Then, Dr. Olo, you asked about the run-of-the-mill lawyer. I didn't know they are run-of-the-mill lawyers because we train very good ones. So it must also be where you get them from. But that having been said, if you can't, remember I talked about the man of law. The man of law is also the person who's going to access legal services. So if you're a person, what the lawyers would call a man of straw, who has no deep pockets, you may not even afford a lawyer. And you see, there's even a saying about your right is not going to come to you, because the nature of vindication of rights is that you actually go and put it out and argue it out. So that, again, is a contradiction. And it is coloring the context within which people implement their constitutional rights. So even though you have all the rights, like when I looked at the Constitution on 28th August 2010, I thought it was time to retire. Because, you know, all the things that we had been talking about were in there. Alas, basically they were going to be more contested. There was nothing that we asked for that we didn't get. But going and getting the right, enjoying it, implementing it is a different story. Then the issue of Amartya Sen. I'm actually familiar with Amartya Sen's work. And the whole issue of how poverty actually is an unfreedom and an absence of rights. And there is also, I think it's Maria Nussbaum, has also written about this capabilities approach. But in an inaugural lecture, I was advised by Professor Ojwang to avoid dark alleys. Because Amartya Sen, I probably had Amartya Sen in an earlier draft. But then it takes you into discussions that require you to tell a lot more than you have time and space to do. So in essence, it's not absent because of ignorance. And also because I don't think it's important, it's very important.
Patricia, anyway, I was in Nigeria for 16 years, and there used to be a lawyer called Chief Rotimi Williams. And Chief Rotimi Williams was the most expensive lawyer, and all people, nearly all people who hired him, murderers and what have you, won their cases. And you should, as we move along, you should comment on it. I want to look back first. Did I see a hand? Yes. You have a loud voice, and then there's a microphone there.
I wanted to find out whether we are also entitled to ask a question. Yes. So that question was also, in terms of equality, already responded to. Secondly, I would like to commend Patricia for her wonderful lecture, and I would like to ask her a question that when I've been teaching gender law, it doesn't really fit for men perhaps, but I've done it some time back. And there's a distinction between equality and sameness. Although you're not equal, although you're equal, you're not the same. And she has led us through gender law, environmental law, and I would like to ask her if she can perhaps allude a few sentences to the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which I find extremely important in terms of the developmental aspect from an African perspective. Thank you.
One of the proposed to deal with the gatekeepers, read people in authority, if you will. You said that we should use measures beyond the law to challenge, engage, and disarm. Can you give us examples of those measures?
Ben Sianga, I teach constitutional law at the Intellectual Property School of Law with Professor Bote. All protocols observed, that's good, but my topic is brief. I appreciate the presentation. You made a presentation on the identity questions. You've focused on gender, which obviously is where you've done a lot of field and empirical and analytical research. What would you say about the question of ethnicity, the clan at county and constituency level as we go there now, etc., either on their own, in their own rights as identity questions, or as a subtext to the broader gender discourse that you have done quite a lot of work on in this inaugural. And related to that, which is brief, is this.
It's about student universal going up to listen to lecture. But I would like to know one thing in this area. The relation between caste homes and equalities and inequalities. And this is really a common caste homes you can find that people value, especially the very Christianity lives. We can find that we don't, in the Jewish culture, they don't really value the equality when it comes back to Christianity. When we look at our old area where we have come from, we find that we value our customs that men are more equal than ladies. So like she's also at an area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, for your question on sameness and the difference. And I think this is at the heart, again, it would have been a dark alley. Because when you begin to talk about sameness and difference, when I was writing this inaugural, I went to a bank and there were 2 police officers. And they were talking about whether the commissioner of police should be a woman. You know, now, we are very politically correct. Where there's a woman, then if it's a man, then a woman. And this man said, she should be there, but she should not talk. and basically, I asked him, but why shouldn't she talk? And she said, you know, there are certain things that women shouldn't do. And of course, again, one of the other contradictions I've seen, and I think we're going to be dealing with it, is when we talk about women in the military. Yes, are we going to take women to combat? And then we go back to when I was talking about employment and the issue of private, reproductive, public, productive. How do you balance that? And I think those are issues in when you talk about sameness and difference. And how do you ensure that difference is not just because people are men or women, but that you also enable people to perform their private reproductive, even as the public productive may be limited. I don't know whether I've answered that. But then the other issue you raise is the common but differentiated responsibility. And that, again, is a principle in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where it was accepted that even though climate change affects all of us, there are certain countries that contributed more than others. And I think that is one area where developed countries actually accepted they contributed a lot more. And it's not necessarily the case that they will suffer more than we will. Actually, the evidence is that the African continent, which emits very little greenhouse gas content, is going to suffer the most. But there is a cooperation, and that is when they talk about common but differentiated responsibility. The acceptance that we live in one globe, that if there's climate change, it affects all of us. We need to look at our capabilities again and then allocate or assign responsibilities. And this is why African countries have not had obligations, legally binding obligations in the climate change realm. But of course, that again is changing. You have countries on a high emission trajectory, and so when we come up with the next regime for climate change in 2015, we want to see whether we can actually maintain the common but differentiated responsibility, which to me is actually an equality principle. Then Professor Kaimenyi asks me, how do you challenge, engage, and disarm gatekeepers? In my many years of the study of gender, I realized being combative does not actually get you very far. Because you see, people just begin to think you make noise. And I go back again to my grandmother. And I was saying that she was soft-spoken. And one of the things that I'm yet to learn from her is not to gesticulate, because she always talked with her hands behind her. And you see, if you talk with your hands behind you, then you're disarming. And you have to use different, I'm sure Professor Wanjiku Kabira has some things to talk about disarming and engaging. It's not legal. You can't actually talk about it, but it is talking, leveling with a person. Like when somebody tells you that you really